The courtroom was silent, too silent. You could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, the subtle creak of leather chairs as people shifted uncomfortably, and the distant ticking of a wall clock counting down the seconds to what felt like an inevitable end. Sarah Benson sat at the defense table, her palms slick with sweat, her heart pounding so loudly she wondered if everyone else could hear it. The judge's hand hovered over the gavel, ready to bring it down and, with it, the weight of a guilty verdict that could destroy her life. But just as the judge's lips parted to speak, something happened that no one in that room, especially Sarah, could have anticipated. Rewind 3 months. Sarah was living the life she had always dreamed of in Willow Creek, a sleepy Texas town where everyone knew everyone. As a beloved high school teacher, she had a reputation for being kind, hardworking, and deeply committed to her students. Her days were filled with lesson plans, after-school tutoring, and the occasional coffee with her colleague and once close friend, Jessica Miller. Jessica was different. Ambitious and sharp-tongued, she had always seen Sarah as both a friend and a rival. When the school announced that Sarah had been promoted to head of the English department, a position Jessica had openly coveted, their friendship began to fracture in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. A cold glance here. A backhanded compliment there. But Sarah never imagined that these tensions could escalate into something life-altering. That all changed on a chilly morning in March. Sarah arrived at school like any other day, only to be met by flashing red and blue lights in the parking lot. Jessica was being loaded into an ambulance, her face bruised, her arm in a makeshift sling. Whispers filled the hallways. "Did you hear? Jessica was attacked in the parking lot." The rumor mill worked fast in Willow Creek, but nothing prepared Sarah for what came next. Later that afternoon, 2 police officers showed up at her classroom door. The look in their eyes made her stomach drop before they even spoke. "Sarah Benson, you're under arrest for the assault of Jessica Miller." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Her students gasped, some even cried as the officers handcuffed her and read her rights. Sarah's mind raced. This has to be a mistake. Jessica knows I didn't do this. But as they led her out of the building, past shocked faces and judgmental stares, a horrifying realization settled in. Jessica had named her as the attacker. Back in the courtroom, Sarah's attorney, Tom Grayson, had done everything he could to dismantle the prosecution's case, but the evidence was damning. There were blurry security camera images showing 2 figures arguing in the parking lot, one matching Sarah's build and wearing a coat like hers. There was Jessica's tearful testimony, describing how Sarah had snapped over a minor disagreement and lashed out violently. The jury watched, spellbound, as Jessica painted Sarah as a woman scorned, someone hiding a darker side beneath her sweet exterior. Sarah's alibi? She was at home grading papers. Alone. It was her word against Jessica's, and in a town where people trusted what they saw more than what they heard, things weren't looking good. As the trial dragged on, Sarah's world crumbled. Friends she'd known for years avoided her in the grocery store. Her parents stopped answering calls, too embarrassed to face their neighbors. Even her lawyer, though professional, seemed to be preparing for the worst. And now, here she was, sitting in that suffocating courtroom, her future hanging by a thread. The judge cleared his throat. The gavel in his hand felt like the final nail in the coffin. But before the words guilty or not guilty could leave his mouth, Jessica did something no one expected. She stood up. Her eyes welled with tears, not the same performative tears she had shed during her testimony, but something raw, something different. The entire courtroom turned toward her, the judge freezing mid-sentence. I can't do this anymore," Jessica stammered, her voice shaking. "I have to tell the truth." The room erupted into chaos. Gasps echoed off the walls, the judge banged his gavel furiously to restore order, and Sarah sat frozen, barely able to process what she'd just heard. Jessica's next words would change everything. What would you do if someone you trusted accused you of something you didn't do? Would you forgive them or fight back? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for the next part of this unbelievable story. The courtroom buzzed with confusion, murmurs rippling through the crowd like a wave. The judge slammed his gavel down again, his voice booming across the room. "Order in the court!" But how could there be order after what Jessica Miller had just said? Sarah sat frozen in her chair, her mind spinning. Did Jessica really just admit to lying? The woman who had destroyed her life with a single accusation was now, right here, in front of everyone, about to reveal the truth. But just as suddenly as Jessica had spoken, her lawyer yanked her back down into her seat, whispering furiously in her ear. The judge, clearly rattled but trying to maintain control, called for a recess. "We'll resume in 1 hour," he announced, his gavel striking the soundboard like a gunshot. Sarah's lawyer, Tom Grayson, leaned in close, his voice low but urgent. "Stay calm. Whatever she's about to say, we'll be ready." But even Tom, with all his years in the courtroom, couldn't hide the flicker of surprise in his eyes. This wasn't just unusual, this was unprecedented. As Sarah sat in the cold, sterile conference room with Tom, the weight of the last few months pressed down on her like a physical force. How did I even get here? It all started with those security camera images. The footage showed 2 women in the dimly lit school parking lot, their figures blurry but their movements heated. There was no sound, but the aggressive gestures told a story all on their own. One woman, wearing a coat that looked exactly like Sarah's, was seen confronting the other, followed by what appeared to be a struggle. Moments later, Jessica was found on the ground, bruised and shaken. When the footage was first presented in court, Sarah had felt a rush of disbelief. "That can't be me. I wasn't even there." But the prosecution pounced on the footage like a predator on wounded prey. They pointed out the coat, the build, even the way the woman in the video walked, a slight limp that Sarah had from a recent ankle sprain. It all seemed to line up. Then came Jessica's testimony. Jessica had taken the stand looking every bit the victim, her arm still in a sling, a bandage visible on her forehead. Her voice quivered as she recounted how Sarah had snapped after a disagreement about the department promotion. She described in vivid detail how Sarah had cornered her in the parking lot, yelling accusations before suddenly lashing out. "She hit me," Jessica had whispered, her voice barely audible. "She just wouldn't stop." The jury had eaten it up. Sarah could see it in their faces, the way they leaned forward, captivated by Jessica's trembling words. It didn't matter that Sarah had no history of violence, or that there were no other witnesses. The combination of the video footage and Jessica's emotional testimony was a powerful 1-2 punch. Sarah's alibi? She had been home grading papers. Alone. No texts, no calls, no one to back her up. Just her word against Jessica's. And in a town like Willow Creek, where everyone knew each other, people were quick to form opinions. Outside the courtroom, Sarah's life unraveled. She lost her job at the school within days of her arrest. The principal, once a close mentor, left a cold voicemail thanking her for her service but insisting they had no choice. Friends she'd known for years stopped returning her calls. Even her parents, her own flesh and blood, began to distance themselves, their voices strained and awkward during the few conversations they did have. The media didn't help. Local news outlets latched onto the story like vultures, painting Sarah as a teacher with a hidden temper. Headlines screamed, "Beloved teacher or secret aggressor." Small town shaken by shocking assault allegations. Everywhere Sarah went, she felt eyes on her. Whispered conversations would die out when she walked into a room. She couldn't even go to the grocery store without feeling the weight of their judgment. People she had shared barbecues with, attended church with, now looked at her like she was a stranger, or worse, a criminal. The trial itself felt like a formality. The prosecution had a narrative, and they stuck to it. Sarah's lawyer tried to poke holes in Jessica's story, but every time he did, Jessica had an answer. She was convincing, even to Sarah at times. "Maybe I did something I don't remember," Sarah had thought in her darkest moments. "Maybe this is all some twisted misunderstanding." But deep down, she knew the truth. She hadn't done it. Now, sitting in that cold conference room, everything felt surreal. Do you think she's really going to confess? Sarah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. I've seen a lot in my time, but this is new. He looked her in the eyes, his expression softening. Whatever happens, we'll handle it. Just be ready. An hour later, the courtroom doors creaked open, and everyone filed back in. The air was thick with anticipation. Sarah could feel it, the tension so heavy it was almost suffocating. The judge took his seat, his face a mask of professionalism, though his eyes betrayed his curiosity. Is the prosecution ready to proceed? He asked. But before the prosecutor could respond, Jessica stood up again. This time, there was no stopping her. I need to speak, she said, her voice louder, clearer. All eyes turned to her, the entire room holding its breath. The judge raised an eyebrow but gave a reluctant nod. Proceed, Ms. Miller. Jessica swallowed hard, then looked directly at Sarah. For a moment, the room faded away. It was just the two of them, former friends, now adversaries, locked in a battle that neither had wanted. I lied, Jessica whispered, her voice cracking. Sarah didn't attack me. She didn't do anything. The words hit like a lightning bolt. Gasps echoed through the room. The prosecutor's jaw dropped. The judge's gavel hovered in midair, forgotten. Jessica's next words were even more shocking. I made it all up, because I was jealous. She got the promotion I wanted, and I couldn't handle it. The room descended into chaos. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The jury sat in stunned silence. And Sarah? She felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. After months of living in a nightmare, the truth was finally out. But what came next would be even more difficult. For a moment, the entire courtroom stood frozen, as if time itself had hit pause. Jessica Miller's confession hung in the air, dense and suffocating, pressing down on everyone in the room. The judge, who had been moments away from delivering a verdict that could have destroyed Sarah Benson's life, sat back in his chair, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. The prosecutor was the first to react. He shot up from his seat, his voice sharp and incredulous. Your Honor, I need a moment to confer with my client. But the judge wasn't having it. Sit down, Mr. Reynolds, he snapped, his gavel slamming down with finality. Ms. Miller, do you understand the gravity of what you've just said? Jessica nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. For once, they didn't seem rehearsed. Yes, Your Honor. I lied. I can't live with it anymore. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to capture every detail, their fingers flying across keyboards, already crafting headlines. Jurors whispered furiously among themselves, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright anger. The gallery buzzed with murmurs of disbelief, some people gasping audibly, others shaking their heads in silent judgment. But Sarah? Sarah just sat there. Frozen. Her mind couldn't process what was happening. For months, she had prepared herself for the worst. She had imagined hearing the word guilty and feeling her world collapse. She had rehearsed how she'd keep her head high, how she'd survive behind bars. She had braced for the loneliness, the betrayal, the shame. But she hadn't prepared for this. She hadn't prepared to hear the truth. As the judge ordered Jessica into custody for perjury, Sarah finally found the strength to breathe. It felt foreign, like her body had forgotten how. Her lawyer, Tom Grayson, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but even he seemed stunned into silence. Jessica was led away in handcuffs, her head bowed, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. Sarah watched her go, a whirlwind of emotions churning inside her, relief, anger, confusion. But beneath it all, there was a question that Sarah couldn't shake. Why now? Why had Jessica chosen this moment to confess? After months of letting Sarah rot under the weight of false accusations, why had she suddenly decided to tell the truth? The courtroom emptied slowly, the buzz of shocked voices lingering in the air. As Sarah stepped outside, she was immediately blinded by the flash of cameras. Reporters swarmed her, shoving microphones in her face, shouting over one another in a frenzy. "Sarah, how do you feel after Jessica's confession? Do you plan to press charges? What do you have to say to the people who doubted you?" The questions came at her like bullets, but Sarah couldn't find the words to answer. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than the reporters, louder than the world. Tom pushed through the crowd, shielding her as best he could. "No comments for now," he barked, guiding her toward his car. "Let's get out of here." Back in the quiet of Tom's office, the reality began to sink in. "You're free, Sarah," Tom said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's over." But it didn't feel over. Sarah stared at the floor, her mind replaying every painful moment of the past few months, the cold stares from former friends, the hushed whispers in grocery store aisles, the crushing silence from her own family. The stain of Jessica's lie had seeped into every corner of her life. "Is it really over?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "How do I come back from this?" Tom sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That's up to you. But there's one thing we need to discuss." Sarah looked up, her heart sinking. She knew what was coming. "Do you want to press charges against Jessica?" he asked. "You have every right to sue her for defamation, emotional distress, and damages. We can take her for everything she's got." The thought of dragging Jessica through a legal battle should have filled Sarah with satisfaction. After all, Jessica had tried to ruin her life. She had turned Sarah into a pariah in her own town, destroyed her career, and left her emotionally shattered. But as Sarah sat there, staring at the paperwork Tom slid across the desk, she felt empty. Would suing Jessica fix what had been broken? Would it erase the months of humiliation, the sleepless nights, the fear of being seen as someone she wasn't? Or would it just prolong the pain? The next few days were a blur. News of Jessica's confession spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. People who had once avoided Sarah now flooded her with apologies. Her phone buzzed nonstop with messages from former friends, neighbors, even distant relatives who wanted to make things right. But Sarah didn't know if she could forgive them. The same people who had whispered behind her back were now offering sympathy, pretending like they hadn't believed the worst about her. The betrayal cut deep, and Sarah wasn't sure she could just pretend it hadn't happened. The school board reached out, offering her job back. They claimed they had always believed in her, but Sarah knew better. Their silence during the trial had spoken louder than any words ever could. And then there was Jessica. Through Tom, Sarah learned that Jessica had been released on bail while awaiting her own trial for perjury. She was holed up in her house, avoiding the media, but rumors swirled that she was trying to reach out to Sarah. Sarah didn't know if she wanted to hear from her. What could Jessica possibly say that would make any of this better? The decision weighed heavily on Sarah. Everyone expected her to press charges. Her friends, those who had come crawling back, urged her to sue Jessica into oblivion. The media speculated endlessly about what she'd do next. But late one night, as Sarah sat alone in her apartment, staring at the ceiling, she realized something. Holding on to the anger, the bitterness, it wasn't helping. It wasn't healing. It was just another kind of prison. The next morning, Sarah called Tom. "I'm not pressing charges," she said firmly. "I'm done letting her control my life." Tom was silent for a moment before he nodded. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Sarah replied. "I just want to move on." But moving on wouldn't be as easy as it sounded. Even though Jessica's lie had been exposed, the scars it left behind were deep. Sarah had to rebuild her life from the ground up, not just her career, but her trust in people, in the world around her. And as much as she wanted to leave it all behind, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. Because sometimes, the hardest part of finding the truth is figuring out what to do with it. The days following Jessica's confession felt surreal. Sarah Benson should have felt free, light even, but the truth was more complicated. The weight that had been lifted from her shoulders left behind a hollow space, an emptiness she couldn't shake. The town of Willow Creek buzzed with gossip, but this time, Sarah was no longer the villain. She was the victim of a vicious lie, the woman who had been wrongly accused, and now everyone wanted a piece of her story. But what happens when the story doesn't end the way people expect? By the end of the week, Sarah found herself back at the Willow Creek High School parking lot, the same place where her nightmare had begun. The lot looked exactly the same, the faded yellow lines, the old lampposts casting long shadows across the pavement, the faint scent of freshly cut grass from the nearby football field. But Sarah felt different. She wasn't the same person who had pulled into this lot months ago, humming along to the radio, blissfully unaware of what was coming. The school board had offered her job back, but walking through those doors felt impossible. How could she stand in front of her students again, knowing that some of their parents had whispered about her guilt? That college she'd once considered friends had turned their backs on her the moment things got tough. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Tom Grayson, her lawyer. She sighed and answered. "Hey, Tom. You sure about this?" he asked, skipping any formalities. "We've still got time to file. Jessica deserves to pay for what she did." Sarah leaned against her car, staring at the school building. Did Jessica deserve to pay? Absolutely. But would dragging her through the courts fix anything? "I'm sure," Sarah said quietly. "I don't want to be tied to this anymore. I just want to move on." There was a pause on the other end before Tom sighed. "You're stronger than most, Sarah. I'm here if you change your mind." But moving on wasn't as easy as it sounded. Everywhere Sarah went, people approached her with awkward smiles and even more awkward apologies. The same neighbors who had avoided her in the grocery store were now stopping her in the aisles, saying things like, "We always knew you couldn't have done it," even though Sarah knew better. The local news outlets reached out for interviews, offering to let her tell her side of the story. But Sarah wasn't interested in being anyone's headline anymore. And then there were the messages from Jessica. At first, Sarah ignored them. What could Jessica possibly say that would make any of this better? But after the third voicemail, curiosity got the better of her. "Sarah, it's Jessica," the message began, her voice shaky. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to explain. Please, meet me. One time. That's all I'm asking." Sarah stared at her phone for a long time after the message ended. Every instinct screamed at her to delete it, to erase Jessica from her life completely. But another part of her, the part that still wanted closure, hesitated. A week later, Sarah found herself standing outside Jessica's house. It was strange how familiar everything felt, the chipped paint on the porch, the wind chimes clinking softly in the breeze. They had shared so many good times here, wine nights, lesson planning sessions, even silly debates over who had the best classroom decorations. But now, the house felt cold, like it belonged to a stranger. Jessica opened the door before Sarah could even knock. She looked smaller. Her confident, sharp exterior had crumbled, leaving behind someone who looked fragile, broken. "Thanks for coming," Jessica whispered, stepping aside to let Sarah in. Sarah crossed the threshold, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure why she was here. Maybe to get answers. Maybe just to see the woman who had turned her life upside down face to face. They sat at the kitchen table in silence for a long moment before Jessica finally spoke. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I need you to understand why I did it." Sarah folded her arms, her gaze steady. "You destroyed my life over a promotion. What else is there to understand?" Jessica flinched, as if the words physically hurt. "It wasn't just the promotion," she admitted. "I was angry. At everything. At myself, at the school, at how easy things seemed for you." She paused, swallowing hard. "I was falling apart, Sarah. And when you got that job, it felt like proof that I was a failure. I wasn't thinking straight. I wanted to hurt someone, and you were the easiest target." The words hung between them, heavy and bitter. Sarah felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but it wasn't as strong as she expected. maybe because she'd spent so long being angry that there was nothing left to burn. "You could have ruined me," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "You did ruin me." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "I know. And I'll live with that for the rest of my life." For a moment, Sarah just stared at her, trying to reconcile the friend she once knew with the woman sitting across from her. And then, to her own surprise, Sarah stood up. "I'm not going to sue you," she said quietly. Jessica looked up, shocked, but Sarah continued before she could speak. "But not because you don't deserve it. I'm letting this go for me. Because I need to move on, and holding on to this anger is just another way you win." Jessica's lips trembled, but she said nothing as Sarah turned and walked out the door. That night, Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about everything that had happened, the trial, the betrayal, the confession, and for the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. She had faced her worst nightmare and come out the other side. And while the scars were still there, they were a reminder of her strength, not her weakness. The next morning, Sarah opened her laptop and began typing. Not for a courtroom, not for a news outlet, but for herself. She wrote about her experience, the fear, the anger, the resilience. And as her words flowed onto the screen, she realized that this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. If you were in Sarah's position, would you have met with Jessica? Could you forgive someone who tried to ruin your life? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for the final chapter of this powerful story. Weeks passed, but the echoes of the trial still lingered in Sarah Benson's life like the faint scent of smoke after a fire. The town of Willow Creek had moved on to the next big story, but for Sarah, the aftermath wasn't so easily forgotten. The truth had set her free, yes, but freedom came with its own kind of weight. Sarah decided not to return to Willow Creek High School. The offer to reclaim her old job sat in her inbox, unread and unanswered. She knew she could never walk those halls again without feeling the sting of betrayal from colleagues who had abandoned her at the first sign of scandal. The school wasn't just a building filled with classrooms anymore, it was a graveyard of trust, and Sarah wasn't interested in mourning what had been lost. Instead, she focused on rebuilding her life, piece by fragile piece. One morning, Sarah found herself sitting in a quiet cafe in the next town over, her laptop open in front of her. She stared at the blinking cursor on the blank document, the weight of unwritten words pressing down on her. She had started writing about her experience, not for revenge, not to relive the trauma, but to reclaim her narrative. The words flowed slowly at first, like a trickle from a long dry faucet. But soon, they poured out of her in waves. She wrote about the fear of being falsely accused, the isolation of being shunned by her community, and the emotional toll of watching her life unravel while the world cheered on her downfall. But most importantly, she wrote about resilience, about finding strength in the face of overwhelming odds and refusing to let someone else's lies define her. She didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but that wasn't the point. Writing it down was her way of taking back control, of turning pain into power. One evening, as she was finishing another chapter of her manuscript, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Tom Grayson, her lawyer and now one of the few people she trusted completely. "Tom, you might want to check the news. Looks like Jessica's story isn't over yet." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She opened the news app on her phone and there it was, splashed across every local headline. Jessica Miller faces additional charges for prior false accusations. Her breath caught in her throat as she read on. Apparently, Sarah wasn't the first person Jessica had tried to frame. An old acquaintance from college had come forward, sharing how Jessica had once falsely accused her of academic dishonesty, nearly getting her expelled. Another former coworker revealed that Jessica had spread vicious lies to sabotage her career as well. The town that had once blindly believed Jessica's sob story was now turning on her with equal fervor. Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that the truth was finally coming out, but also a deep, gnawing sadness. Jessica's actions had hurt a lot of people, but underneath all that malice was clearly someone deeply broken. Sarah closed the news app and set her phone down, staring out the cafe window at the sunset. The sky was streaked with fiery reds and oranges, a reminder that endings, no matter how painful, could also be beautiful. The next day, Sarah received an unexpected email. It was from a publishing company that had somehow caught wind of her manuscript. "Ms. Benson," the email began, "we've heard about your incredible story of resilience and would love to discuss the possibility of turning your manuscript into a book." Sarah stared at the screen, her heart racing. She had written her story for herself, never imagining that it might reach a wider audience. But maybe this was exactly what she needed, not just to heal herself, but to help others who had faced injustice and betrayal. She replied with a simple, "I'd love to discuss it further." Months later, Sarah's book hit the shelves under the title, "The Price of the Truth: How I Survived a Lie That Almost Ruined My Life." It wasn't just a memoir of her experience, it was a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. The response was overwhelming. Readers from all over the country reached out, sharing their own stories of betrayal, false accusations, and hard-fought justice. Sarah found herself at the center of a community she never knew existed, a network of people bound not by shared trauma, but by shared resilience. One evening, after a book signing event in a nearby city, Sarah sat alone in her hotel room, reflecting on how far she had come. The pain was still there, buried deep, but it no longer defined her. She had taken back her life, one word at a time. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. "I read your book. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you found peace." Sarah stared at the message for a long time, knowing exactly who it was from. Jessica. She thought about replying, about offering some kind of closure, but in the end, she simply turned off her phone. She didn't need to revisit the past. She had written her final chapter, and now it was time to move forward. As Sarah closed her eyes that night, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The truth had come at a price, yes, but in the end, it had set her free.